Greetings all. Well, yesterday we did a video on the last show here where Kahoa showed us about some of the physical aspects of transplanting some orchids. So we did some oncidiums and we did some cattleya. Both of those are sympodial type orchids that have multiple shoots that come up. So anyway, after looking at the video, it was all right, I guess, but I decided that there just wasn't enough theory about why do we transplant an orchid. And so, of course, the expert orchid growers out there, well, you know all this stuff. I'm really basically talking here to brand new growers, or maybe even people who have been afraid to deal with orchids because they think they're difficult, you know. So let's talk about the basics of 101. Why do we transplant orchids? Okay, well, here. Okay, right there. That's a real good reason. Here's another real good reason why we transplant an orchid. These are both cattleya orchids. They are both growing out of their pots, and they're also infested with ferns and moss and other things that need to get pulled out of here. But the point being is that when this orchid was originally planted, as Kahoa was saying yesterday, they put the growing point right over here in the center of the pot, and they aimed it that way. So they took their orchid and they moved it to the middle of the pot, and they let it grow this way. Well, over time, it began to grow, and eventually it left the pot completely. The growing tip is right over here now. And so it's coming right out of the pot. The same over here. This one's really doing a good job of leaving the container. You can see that. Yeah, here's where the new growth is coming, is right here. And it's heading outward. The old growth was potted back in here. So that's one reason, okay, because our orchids leave the pots and become completely ungainly, and then we just can't deal with them. Cattleyas are real good at that. Some of the bigger varieties will just grow way out of the pot, you know, Lycoris do the same thing. Those are all what we call sympodial orchids. They have multiple stems at ground level, multiple pseudobulbs, and so the orchid kind of grows like this, inching its way along, sort of like a clumping bamboo or something on that order. It makes a little shoot, and another shoot comes up, then it makes another shoot forward, another shoot comes up. If they're planted with the growing tip, which is right here, to the middle of the container, then when they grow, they have room to move this way before they leave the pot. All right, so sympodial orchids have that problem, but here is a monopodial orchid. This is Phalaenopsis, or the moth orchid. It's a very, very, very common orchid for houseplants. I highly recommend them if you're indoor orchid growing. They're one of the best. And these only have a single stem. It's just one stem, that's it. Vandas are like that too. Vandas have only a single stem. And so this does grow sideways to some extent, but not very much, okay? So the monopodial orchids, or one-stem orchids, can be grown in the same size container for quite a long period of time, whereas the sympodial orchids either have to be divided, cut in two, made two plants, or the pots have to be increased in size to accommodate that creeping nature. Okay, so this is one reason why we transplant an orchid. The other reason, and that's probably the most important, because the orchids don't care whether they're growing in the pot or out of the pot. Yeah, it's got to get over the whole thing about needs pots, got to be in soil. No. Most of the orchids you grow are epiphytic, means grow up in trees. See, So they naturally grow without any soil around them. They're perfectly adapted for growth out of soil, provided they can find enough water and enough food wherever they're situated. Now, there are some terrestrial orchids, means orchids that grow on the earth. Most common ones, the Cymbidium orchid from South Asia, or the Paphiopedilum, the lady slipper orchid, Minnesota state flower. Yeah, that one, that's also a terrestrial orchid, grows in the ground. So those orchids, they're going to use a different kind of media when we're transplanting, more soil-like, than the epiphytic orchids that don't want soil around. Okay, and so let's start talking about media. The reason that we change the media in the orchid pots or transplant them is because the media begins to break down. It breaks down rapidly. Orchids take a lot of water and a lot of fertilizing, and because of that, they break down the media that we have in the pots very, very quickly. And so the general rule about orchids is you transplant after every flowering. So like a Phalaenopsis here, the Phalaenopsis is going to bloom probably twice a year for you. And so that means twice a year you're pulling it out of the pot, you're shaking off all the bark, and you're putting it back in with new bark. Now, again, it doesn't need a bigger pot ordinarily. It takes a long time for a monopodial orchid to get so big that you have to increase the pot size. Okay. And so it's just mostly because you don't want the bark turning into fine particles like soil. If that happens, the orchid is dead. It will rot away in the media, you see. There's only a few rules about growing an orchid. They're actually incredibly simple, fairly easy plants, very rewarding because of the flowers and the curious forms that they have. But there's only a few rules. They need light and they need water, and they need those two in about equal proportions, and they're the most important things. All right, so right light, proper watering schedule. Past that, transplanting. I can say that over again. Transplanting. Because if the media breaks down, it's the end of your orchid. That's the quickest way to kill one. Leave it in the pot too long. Yes, they will die. Past that again, fertilizer. Orchids will survive and kind of eke along with very, very low nutrient levels, but they won't perform right. And so if you want a beautiful orchid that's robust and keeps blooming, you will need to feed too. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, light, water, media change, and fertilizer. Past that, you really don't need to know too much about this. They'll grow pretty much on their own. They know what they're doing. All plants do. Just give them a chance. Anyway, so the media does break down. In the case of the Phalaenopsis, it's going to flower twice a year, so that means you're going to transplant it twice a year. The Phale has very, very heavy roots, like the Cattleyas do. And so on orchids like that, we generally use a fairly coarse media. What I have in my hand here is what we used to call fir bark. Okay, it no longer comes from fir trees. It's predominantly now coming from pine. This is from New Zealand. It's Monterey pine bark, the California pine grown in New Zealand, shipped back here. There's not as much fir bark around as there used to be. And so this is pine bark, and it's a coarse aggregate. The coarse aggregate, or large size, is really good on large rooted orchids, orchids with a large diameter to the root, and it's really good where you have a lot of water. If you tend to overwater your plants, then you want to use a coarse media. If you're in an area like Mountain View, and Phalaenopsis and Cattleyas don't really like the rain we get as much here, if they're in pots, you use a coarse media because it's going to drain out quickly and keep the orchid from rotting. Now, there are other bark grades. There's a medium grade, and then there is a fine grade. This is a very fine one right here that we happen to have bags of. Came to us through the Orchid Society. We don't usually use this grade very much. But it is good to use when you have a fine-rooted orchid. So any orchid that has little fine root hairs works better on finer medias. Orchids that tend to prefer a little bit more moisture, probably better off with finer medias. And that said about moisture, when you have an orchid that really likes moisture, and it tends to be pretty thirsty, then either all sphagnum moss or part sphagnum moss in the media is probably better. We tend to, this is again from New Zealand sphagnum. Most of my life I used Wisconsin sphagnum, which is a little different, but pretty much works the same. This here, we use it on the lady slippers, and I use it on Miltonias and on Miltoniopsis. They all tend to be water thirsty, and they will dry out faster than other orchids. And so if everybody's on the same watering schedule together, if we have some sphagnum in the pots on the thirsty ones and bark in the pots on the less thirsty ones, then everybody can get watered on the same day, and it usually works out pretty well. So there is a purpose for sphagnum moss. It's also a good media to use because it's relatively sterile. It holds a lot of air and water, so it's kind of dual. Now, when it comes to any other medias, when you're planting orchids, there's a few requirements about what the media needs to do, how it needs to perform, but past that, you can use almost anything. I mean, I once saw an experiment where they grew orchids, they were Phalaenopsis, on shredded athletic shoes, used shredded athletic shoes, and they worked fine. Yeah, they grew fine on, old Nikes. The only problem with that is that, shredded athletic shoes aren't very attractive on your windowsill, and pine bark probably smells better when you water it. But they're really not very picky. They want a media that's not going to break down very fast. Generally speaking, we don't want to hold too much moisture. Things that the roots like to cling and adhere to are good. The bark works well because this is what they do in nature. They cling to bark. See, that's one reason we use bark. But we can use tree fern trunk, tree fern fibers. We can use lava cinder. You can use gravel. You could use synthetic lava rock like zeolite. I can go on and on like this, and then plus when you get into terrestrial orchids, there you have a media that is a little bit more like a potting soil, usually decomposed wood fines and vermiculite and perlite, maybe sand. So what you're using is not that important, but if you're new at this, I highly recommend that you just, whatever the grower was using in the pot, if it's been working out well for you, just repeat it. Find something that looks pretty much the same. That'd be my suggestion. But each to their own. People build their own medias. There are so many things you can put in medias around here. We often see the bark is often mixed with perlite. That's pretty common. That's the popped white volcanic rock. That increases aeration. I've seen people around here also use styrofoam packing peanuts. I hate them because in my garden, anything in an old flower pot, when I'm done with it, needs to be dumped in the garden, and then I plant corn on it. Okay, I don't plant corn on styrofoam packing peanuts, and so I find them an absolute nuisance. But they do work. Okay, they do work if you're into that kind of stuff. These days most of them are cornstarch anyway. I wouldn't try to use those. They turn into a goopy, snotty mess. So then as far as that's about the medias, all right? And then what about the pots, right? Well, you can see here by looking at this is kind of a special pot. It's got a special indentation here in the bottom with extra drainage around it. This is an extra well-drained 3.5-inch container. It's really, for us around here, this is a standard of what we use on most orchids. Orchids that get too big to fit in one of these usually get split down into 2 plants or hung in a tree or occasionally we'll increase it to a bigger container, all right, on occasion. But if you do that, what you end up with eventually is a very, very large, massive presentation type plant rather than just a nice small orchid plant that fits comfortably on your windowsill. So the type of pot isn't that important. We prefer plastic. Okay, the plastics are usually the good ones, very durable, and if you keep them cleaned, you can use these over and over and over again. So they're excellent at being reused. But they don't rot away. I don't like pots that rot away. There are a number of organic type pots made from peat or other materials that all decompose. Don't care for them. They create problems for me. And the clay pots, which some people think are very pretty, they're a problem, especially if you have hard water. They accumulate salts, which salts are very damaging to orchid roots. They don't like them. And so on clay pots, you'll often get layers of white salt, and that's not very good. Where we use clay pots here is when Ellen has orchids she wants to display in the house or display on the porch or something. We take the orchids in the plastic pots and we set them in really pretty clay pots. They're not really potted in the clay pots. Although there are clay pots out there called crackpots. I guess that's where the term crackpot came from. I've certainly heard that plenty in my life. But they're clay pots, most of them made in Asia, that are full of holes. I don't think I have any of them here at the moment anymore, but because they are filled with holes, and it's so the orchid roots can grow out through the holes. So that's great. But when you go to transplant, there's only one way to get the orchid out. You got to use a hammer and crack the pot, and so mine all cracked. To review and refresh, orchids need water and light in equal amounts. They must be transplanted into fresh media periodically, usually right after bloom, and they need to be fed. And there are specific fertilizers for orchids. I'm not going to cover that in this particular presentation, just to let you know that, yeah, some orchids, like for instance, the very common Phalaenopsis, the moth orchid, it does not like fertilizers with urea. And so when you buy fertilizers for Phalaenopsis or the lady slippers tube, you use a urea-free fertilizer. They're special. Most of the rest of the orchids will put up with a wide variety of water-soluble type fertilizers. Is a good thing to use. I mean, even Miracle-Gro works on the things. Although there are special orchid foods out there. I believe Grow More is one that produces a line of specialized orchid foods. I will frequently, when I'm spraying fish emulsion around here, will open fire on an orchid table with fish emulsion. It works okay. Foods that can be applied liquid really are probably the best and the easiest. On some of the terrestrial orchids, the ones on the ground, I will sometimes use time-release fertilizers like Osmocote or Nutricote. They work okay. I also use those on some of the monopodial epiphytic orchids like Vandas. The Vandas will hang little bags of Osmocote or little containers of Osmocote right on the roots every time it rains, and a little bit leaches out and feeds the root. Seems to work for them. So yeah, there you go. If you ever wondered why is it that people transplant orchids, now you know. If you don't transplant them, they rot away and drop dead. The fastest way for a novice orchid keeper to kill an orchid is to be afraid to transplant. And I am well aware that there are a lot of people out there that are so afraid to take their plants out of pots. This is very common. Orchids will stick to the containers and stick to the media. They have whatever on their roots that will adhere, and it's really kind of hard to get them off sometimes. And so watering thoroughly before you try to remove them is a real good idea. I often turn the pots over and beat on them a little bit. That oftentimes helps. But it's not unusual that you're just going to end up breaking or cutting some of the roots when you do this. They'll stick to the containers. You'll leave them behind. It's okay. The orchids tolerate limited de-rooting. It's not a problem. And this coho I showed yesterday, we always go in and we look for dead, damaged debris on the plants, and so we cut away a lot of roots, especially if the plant has been getting heavily watered and has been in the same pot for a long time. Then we're probably going to find a lot of rotten roots that all need to be removed. Okay, there we go. That's a 101 on why we transplant orchids. Aloha, and we'll see you later.